What's up everyone, David here, and I do a lot of content on this channel about the Cubase digital audio workstation, but I recently had a mixing project with a deadline and I was on the road and I didn't have my Cubase e-licenser dongle thing, so I decided to pay the 60 bucks and finally get a registered license for REAPER, which is a competing DAW that is much cheaper but equally as powerful. And I used REAPER to finish the mixing project on time, even though I did the mix on headphones. Don't tell anyone. It was a breeze, and REAPER as a mixing environment was awesome. But mixing is really a small part of what I do. And I prefer to be producing and arranging both in audio and MIDI. And after seeing the raw power of such an affordable DAW, I had to ask myself, would REAPER work as a production environment? So I installed it here in the studio, and I went for it. And I liked it. I really liked it. It has a lot to offer. And the question that needs to be asked is, will Talking Leaf Media switch to REAPER permanently? And the answer to that question, which is also a question, is... I know it! But are we gonna? And the answer to that question, and an examination of the differences between Cubase and REAPER, is coming up in the video that follows. So stay tuned. Now before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, which is comparing REAPER to Cubase and trying to determine which one's better, I'd like to talk a little bit about defaults. You see, defaults are how software comes out of the box. And I think a good example of this is Microsoft's Bing. You may know it as the thing that you use one time so that you can install Chrome. But according to Microsoft, the market share for the use of Bing in desktop search in America is 33%. And while that seems hard to believe, their figures worldwide are a more believable 10%. That means that 1 out of every 10 people you see as you walk down the street is a Bing user, not a Google user. And while that may be hard to believe, I think the reason for that is because Bing is the default search engine of any device that comes with Microsoft Windows. And Microsoft Windows is the primary desktop platform of most people in the world. So defaults play a huge role in the window through which you see the world. Now, as a Cubase user, there's a lot of defaults that I use that are different in REAPER. And in REAPER, those defaults seem wrong because they're not the same as Cubase. However, there's 3 types of defaults. Defaults that are better in REAPER because they make more sense. Defaults that are worse in REAPER because they make less sense. And then defaults that are neither better or worse, they're just different, and yet they're worse because they're different and you're not used to them. But I thought for the sake of argument, I should keep REAPER at its default state. I didn't change any key bindings. I used the standard theme. This is the theme that I'm using. And people will say, well, it's all customizable in REAPER, and that is a feature of REAPER, is that everything you can customize. You can customize the look and feel of it, but it's also a bug. Because if you go to the REAPER forums, they'll ask you what skin are you using, and the way that you would accomplish tasks changes in many ways based upon what customizations you've made to your user interface. Now that can be a good thing if you're a power user and you've tweaked it to be the perfect audio production environment for yourself, and yet you'd have to really be that power user. You have more choice, and yet it's more difficult to find solutions to problems because that choice allows you to do whatever you want with the software. Now, some people will say, when I say in this video, I had a hard time doing this, or I had a hard time doing that, they would say, oh, that's easy, you just use this, or you write a custom script and then it'll be available to you. But I didn't really want to focus on that. I wanted to focus on how does REAPER run out of the box and compare it to Cubase. And there are some idiosyncratic things that are a bit different. For instance, the default play behavior, we can see right here I'm at marker 3. The default play behavior is to go back to where you initially started playing, so we can hear that. And whereas Cubase would just pause it at that time where I stopped, in REAPER it actually defaults to go back to play where it was. And in order to stop it in place, you have to hit Control spacebar. So that just takes a little getting used to. I think that's one of those changes that's not better or worse. It's just different. And it makes sense why you would have a default behavior like that for your cursor. But I'm used to the Cubase one, so it makes more sense to me. And if I kill the mixer here, I want to tell you one thing that every software program does differently. Adobe Premiere, which is my video editor, does it different than Cubase and does it different than Reaper, is mouse zooming. So in Reaper, if you just use your scroll wheel on your mouse, you zoom in horizontally. I think you have to hit Alt and scroll to scroll sideways. And then scrolling here, well, I'll expand these so that we have more room. We'll scroll vertically, but you have to have focus here. Control scroll zooms vertically, and shift scroll don't do nothing. Now in Cubase, control scroll zooms in horizontally. That's just what scroll does. Scroll up and down. Let's see. Let's just create. Scroll up and down regardless of where you are. Moves up and down in the project. That would be zoom on Reaper. Shift scroll moves yourself left and right. And Alt scroll doesn't do anything. It's the same as the default scrolling behavior. So that's another example of not better or worse, just different. The cool thing about Reaper, like I said, the customization, is that you have options to change your mouse behavior. Those are options that are not available to you in Premiere and in Cubase as far as I know. You let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But you can change what the scrolling does in Reaper. And if I were to invest more time and energy into Reaper, I would probably change it to the Cubase behavior because that's what I'm so used to. And then there's things that make more sense, but they're just different and I don't like them. Like in Reaper, to record something, and we'll just move to the end of the project here, you hit Control R. Oh. And it just records. And Control R is definitely, it makes sense as a hotkey, as opposed to Reaper, as opposed to Cubase where you hit asterisk on your number key. Control R makes more sense, but I found myself just so used to something that I feel like it's superior, even though it's not superior at all. So now that we've talked about how Cubase and Reaper are not better or not worse, just different, let's talk about a few ways in which Reaper is better. So I think there are three key areas where Reaper does shine. And the first area where Reaper shines over Cubase is that you don't need a stupid dongle to use it. I was on the road, I got the license key, and it worked flawlessly on my laptop. I installed the same license key down here on my desktop, and boom, no muss, no fuss, totally registered. It is cross-platform, and I think they have a Linux beta too, so if you're a Linux nerd like me, you can install it on some of your Linux laptops, even though they're usually older than your Windows laptops. And it's 1/10 the price. And that's another big thing about Reaper is Cubase is not 10 times better than Reaper. I'll tell you that much right now. It costs 10 times as much, plus you have to buy a stupid dongle that you have to cart around with you. So Reaper, in terms of value, it's offering a whole heck of a lot. Now, in terms of functionally, where does it excel over Cubase? I think it excels mostly in flexibility of mixing. Like I said, let's take this piano track here and we'll solo it. So it's receiving input from MIDI, all channels. Now I could actually change that to input from me. And unlike Cubase, there are no track types. So there's just a track. And you hear the effects I have as I monitor it, in addition to the instrument. So let's record. We're recording. So what you end up with is a track that can do both MIDI and audio on the same track. It's more flexible. So tracks can be groups, they can be effects tracks, they can be MIDI tracks, they can be audio tracks. A track is just a track in Reaper, but that gives you a little added flexibility. If you don't want to add an audio track with the same signal chain as your piano, you can just record audio into that track. And where it really shines is in routing. So every track has a little route button, and you can route anything to anything in Reaper. It makes side chaining, even VST2 plugins. It makes mixing and side chaining and routing. You have to understand routing to be able to do it here. But I mean, I immediately took one look at this and said, okay, I understand what's going on. It is as robust as Cubase's system, if not more robust. It's more robust, and it makes perfect sense to me. And it's sort of the way that I wish Cubase was, that you could just route anything to anything. But most importantly, I think, most importantly for sure, is that you don't need a stupid dongle to use it. It's 2018, you know, I got this license, I was able to install it on my laptop and my desktop without having an extra piece of hardware. And when you're producing on the go and you have, you know, an external hard drive, maybe with your sample libraries, you have an audio interface and a MIDI controller, they don't make laptops with all that many ports these days, so you're going to have to dongle it just to bring a hardware DRM. And if that e-licenser dongle gets broken, you're out 10 licenses of Reaper. Those are the three advantages I think Reaper has over Cubase. No dongle, 1/10 the price, and actually a more robust routing system and a more welcoming mixing environment. And now I think it's time to get into what makes Cubase better than Reaper. So Cubase does have some clear advantages over Reaper, and I think that that's undeniable. One thing that you'll notice when you install Cubase is that you have a drum module, Groove Agent SE, you have a Rompler, Haleon Sonic SE, you have a bunch of synthesizers. Reaper does come with a synth called ReaSynth. It's a little janky. But I had a bunch of notes that I was going to talk about Reaper and the things that I found irritating about it. A lot of that was just learning curve. It was user error, not program error. For instance, there was a time when I was working and this output for master track panning, I was clicking around because the panning was screwed up and this had gone to 0. And it was so infuriating because panning didn't work at that point. So if we solo this guitar, it didn't work because this was at 0, but it's really just the stereo width. And that was a user error type thing, so I can't really get too upset about it. One thing I did find trouble with, and I didn't read the manual too much, was doing volume automation. So as you can see here, I just free drew it in the way that I felt it should be. Because I had a hard time, if we look at something like this, if you add, let me just zoom in here. If you add 2 points, it won't honor that second point. I mean, it's stranger behavior than what I'm used to, or it's different. Maybe it's not stranger, but it's different. So, I mean, it sort of makes sense, but it's different than Cubase where you just draw on 1 point. You have to have like 2 stop points. And that I found that a little bit frustrating to do the volume automation here, so I just drew it in freehand, which they do let you do. That's why it looks so messy. But that was a sort of better or worse, not different thing. I feel like automation in Cubase, automation in Reaper, it's a wash. But to be completely honest, where Cubase does shine is in MIDI editing. I did this bass line on my laptop, and I wrote it in, and now if I wanted to select those notes, I would have to control click on them. I can't just click and drag them and delete them. The key editor in Reaper is not as good as the key editor in Cubase. I'm going to just say that right now. The drum editor is not as good. They look the same, they're similar, they have a lot of the same functionality, but judging by defaults, in Cubase, there's all these expression parameters, these chord editing parameters that are not available to you. It's a more robust environment for MIDI sequencing, in my honest opinion. And yes, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different, but navigating with your arrows and making changes, I genuinely believe it's not just that I'm more used to Cubase. I feel like it's easier and it makes more sense in Cubase than it does in Reaper. And that makes sense because Cubase is really sort of, I think, the best in class in terms of being able to sequence MIDI for DAWs. So I give Cubase the tip of the hat, and basically for that reason, for sequencing MIDI, for coming with instruments, and sort of providing a more complete and robust all-around production environment, I think I'll be sticking with Cubase from here on out. But that's not to say that Reaper isn't a fantastic value, that you can't accomplish good work in Reaper. I think that it's the best bang for your buck DAW on the market today, and it's worth checking out. It's just that there's a lot of things in Reaper that are not better or worse, they're just different than Cubase. And I think with any DAW, the key is to choose a DAW, become as comfortable as you can with it, and then hope that they don't go out of business. And in the case of Cubase, hope that the next version gets rid of that stupid dongle. So my name is David. I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion about the differences between Reaper and Cubase. If you've enjoyed this content, please feel free to like or subscribe, and take care of yourselves, everyone. Peace.